Okay, so welcome. This is part one of a series called The Baby in the Bathwater. The baby in the bathwater? Yeah, the whole idea is that I've been noticing people from different religious traditions have been finding out something about the religious tradition that to them offends them. And so what they do is they throw everything away because of the thing that offends them. And what I'm finding is that people are throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Maybe there's truths that they're throwing out because they threw out everything. So we're going to talk about what that's all about, and maybe this is your situation. Maybe you come out of an LDS background and you believed in the fact that there is a prophet, Joseph Smith, and that prophet then told about these gold plates that he had, and he read those gold plates, and from those gold plates started teaching us about who Heavenly Father is, that there's a pre-existence that we were with him in, that there is now a priesthood that's brand new, that's been restored, that there is celestial marriage, and because of celestial marriage, you can make it into the highest of the three heavens, and that whole process is called exaltation. You go, yeah. And he also taught, because of his placement with gold plates and all the other stuff, that there's Jesus is a real person, and that Jesus is really responsible for our atonement, and he's actually our elder brother. And maybe you've thought this for years, but then in recent years, some troubling information has come to mind. Maybe things like the fact that the prophet was into polygamy. And maybe that because of that polygamy, he also married women who were already married to other men, past polyandry. So some of these women he married actually now had two husbands because he advanced on them. Maybe you found out things like the first visions, that there's multiple kind of versions of it, and the best attributed first vision in his own handwriting doesn't match what the church teaches for the first vision. Now that's troubling. Maybe you found out about the anachronisms, that is the things that are out of time that are in the Book of Mormon, like steel and stuff like that. Maybe you found out about the Book of Abraham, that it seems to be just from Joseph Smith's imagination and not from the papyruses that we have, or the Kinderhook plates, or maybe even recently the Peepstone. And so you found all these things out and said, wait a second, if those things are true, then maybe Smith is not a prophet. And if he's not a prophet, maybe the gold plates never existed. And if the gold plates never existed, then maybe everything he's told us about all this other stuff was totally a lie, so I'm out of here, I'm gone. Or maybe your experience is from a Christian perspective. Maybe you've gone to church your entire life, and from that we start with the reference point of the Bible. And the Old Testament especially, start there and say, hey, the Old Testament has Israel in it, the nation of Israel, and Israel's God, Jehovah, or in the Hebrew, Yahweh, and then you find out about the whole history of the relationship of Israel and Yahweh, the Exodus out of Egypt, using Moses as the leader, and then Joshua who brought them into the promised land, and other guys like David who came years later as the king, and Solomon his son, one of the greatest kings, and then Samson and Delilah, the guy with the hair and the big arms, and people like Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel who's carried off into Babylon and became actually quite respected over there with the king Nebuchadnezzar. And then there's, the later prophets of that time, Isaiah and Jeremiah. And then all through that stuff, there's some hints of the fact of this Messiah guy. So, and then you get to the New Testament and you find out, well, there's John the Baptist who's talking about one who's going to come, and that one was Jesus. And more people talk about this Jesus. You got John, and you've got, Peter and Paul, and they wrote all about who this Jesus was. He was central to everything they talked about. There was miracles that he did. There was the resurrection from the dead. There was the book of Revelation. Well, that's crazy. But then you stopped and said, wait a second. There's no such thing as miracles. You can't have miracles. And so the resurrection from the dead couldn't have happened. And Revelation's just a crazy book. And so maybe there never existed Paul and Peter and John and all those other guys. Maybe John the Baptist didn't even exist. Maybe even Jesus himself didn't exist because the New Testament is false. And then you get to the Old Testament and you wonder, well, they endorsed the Old Testament, so maybe there's something wrong with the Old Testament. And then you start looking at the first 10 chapters of Genesis and you say to yourself, wait, a 6-day creation? Adam and Eve, really? There was Adam and Eve instead of evolution? And Noah and the ark. Come on, Noah and the ark and all the animals, that's kind of crazy. So because of all that stuff, I just can't believe that the Old Testament's true. That stuff's just crazy. And if the Old Testament's not true, then maybe there isn't a nation of Israel, maybe there is no Yahweh God, and maybe all this other stuff never really happened, and there never will be a Messiah. So the Bible's false. Now that process is what a lot of people are going through that I talked to today. Whether it's from the LDS camp or even from the standard Christian camp. It's like you're looking at it and saying, because of a handful of things that I have problems with, I'm just going to chuck the whole thing. Well, in chucking the whole thing, what we need to do is rebuild a structure of the existence of God and maybe something more. Maybe we've thrown out something too valuable. Maybe in the process of throwing all that stuff, we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. Maybe there is still some truth in there, but our fundamental basis for truth, which started with Joseph Smith in the LDS case, or even the Bible in the people who leave the church, you've thrown that out as a source of reference for truth. So what is the baby that's thrown out? And that's really what we're going to look at and try and rebuild now that you've thrown away your other foundations of reference. How do you rebuild some kind of understanding of the spiritual world and the nature of God? Is it possible to do that without those as your building place? And so that's what we're going to start to do today. But how do you test truth? How do you know what it is you can build your life in terms of your beliefs on again? And then in a bigger sense, what is a reliable source of truth? If, for instance, I've thrown out the Bible and I've thrown out Joseph Smith, what's a reliable source of truth? Well, in these days, it's science. Science is the accepted source of truth, but it has some problems with it, but we're going to spend most of the morning talking about how to come back to establishing some kind of foundation of what you know, and we're actually going to use science. Science. I can do science. Really? We're going to do that? Well, okay. Why are we going to do this? Well, for one thing, in a world that we live in today, there is no consensus about where truth comes from, by and large. I mean, you have hot spots that believe this and that. But science now in the 21st century has taken over the role of modern prophets and priests. We allow scientists to tell us what's true, and we're supposed to believe it. We look to scientists to improve our life. We look to scientists to be the intermediary between our lives and the hidden world around us. We treat them just like priests were treated in the Old Testament. Scientists. But can you trust science? And we'll talk a little bit about that today. I think you can. Now, the reason I say that is because my training is in science. Now, there's good science and there's bad science, but in general, science is not a bad thing in general. And if you're a Christian that's listening to this, you got to understand that there are people who do science, and if you have people that are flawed, you're going to have good science and bad science. But science by itself, without the flawed people, is really not too bad. But we'll show some of the downsides to that. I was trained in electrical engineering. I have a couple of degrees in electrical engineering. It means I had a lot of physics, and chemistry, and mathematics, and calculus. All those who love calculus? Yeah, okay, there's a few. Not many, but a few. So there's all that kind of stuff. And that's all necessary in order to lay a foundation so that you can turn around and look at the world and make sense of it. My big drive as a child was trying to understand why things are the way they are and how they work. I just, from a child, my mom recognized this. She thought there would be a better way to deal with me instead of me taking apart things in the house like the toaster and being too young to remember how to put it back together. She started buying stuff for me that I could just take apart that we could throw away when it's done because I wasn't going to put it back together. And so she would bring home things. I remember she brought home once an old clock from a car, a dashboard clock. Back in the day when the clocks were big and round, about this size, and they had dials on them, and they went around. And so she brought me one of those once. I took it apart. She just gave me a handful of tools and said, here, get at it, because we're not putting that in our car. And I took it apart and went, whoa, neat. And that's what I've done since I was a child. So I've always had this abiding interest on why are things the way they are? Can we look at things and learn from things? Can we understand why things operate so well? And so that's what eventually led me into science. And that's partially what led me into coming to Jesus. I want to know the way things really are. Now, when I went into electrical engineering, I went into the most mathematically rigorous part of electrical engineering. It's electromagnetics. It's how you can take an electron right here and wiggle it back and forth really fast and have it be heard and affected on an electron that's 100,000 miles away. Now, how can you do that? That's called radios. That's radio waves. Literally, you have a little electron right here that wiggles back and forth in a predetermined kind of apparatus, and you can make electrons wiggle thousands of miles away in someone else's thing. That's radio. What is that thing? What is that invisible power that goes through the air? And so that's what I pursued. I wanted to know what was behind that invisible power. How can an invisible power be real? And so I committed my entire intellectual life in college to trying to figure out how an invisible power can have an effect on mankind. And when I gave my life to Jesus, I asked, how can an invisible power have an effect on mankind? They're very similar, very parallel. So I am pre-biased to accept science. And you may not be because you didn't study too much science. That's okay, I don't care. But I'm going to give you a few scientific examples today about how you can rebuild the notion that maybe God really does exist from science. Now, there's a fallacy going today that science and faith are not compatible. And we're going to talk about why that itself is a fallacy in just a second. But that's the going paradigm. If you go in society and you talk about the fact, I want to talk about God from a scientific perspective, people will say, you can't, because you got faith, which is the God stuff, and you got science, and those two worlds should never touch. But if both of those worlds are attempting to explain the unseen powers, then they should agree where they overlap, right? Otherwise, faith, the whole idea about who God is just wishful thinking. It has no basis in reality at all. Is there reality in the existence of God? Is there reality in the existence of electromagnetic waves that travel across the universe? Yes and yes. And they're both invisible. So science is the actual opportunity we have as human beings to try and understand the unseen by using seeing powers. How do you do that? Well, let's take a look. That's what we're going to do and see if we can work our way to God. Science is kind of cool. It has this method. You use a controlled frame of reference. That means I understand the conditions in which I'm doing an experiment. You do evidence, you find observations, you write things down. You just look at what you can see, and then you ask other people to do independent verification of the same thing. By the way, that failed a couple years ago when out of Utah we had this thing called cold fusion. You remember that? A glass of water, and you stick a couple electrodes in it, and you actually have the reactions of the sun creating power out of a glass of water. Now, there was skepticism because it didn't glow like the sun. There was problems. The reason it ran into problems wasn't because of its theoretical stated premise. It was because when people tried to replicate it, they couldn't get it to happen. So science is sort of self-regulating. That's one of the nice things I like about science. Science already understands that it may be fallible. Really, it does. And you're saying, well, I've met a lot of scientists who don't take that opinion. Well, actually, that's the scientific method, realizing and putting yourself under the idea that what I've just figured out is fallible. I'll wait till other people validate it. I'll wait till in consensus we create enough experiments that we're just forced to this conclusion that that's the way things are. Now, in the scientific method, there's one more step, and the one more step is probably the most critical one. Not only a controlled frame of reference, evidence and observations you make, independent verification, but an inference to the best explanation for that. Now, that's a 21st century phrase for a type of logic that used to be called abductive logic. You heard of deductive logic and inductive logic and abductive logic? You don't know abductive logic? So this is what it is. For instance, a really famous example of abductive logic, and I just love this example. If you went outside in the morning and you woke up and you saw that your grass was wet, abductive logic or inference to the best explanation. What's the best explanation for the fact that your grass is wet in the morning? Rain or sprinklers. So you actually have two. Those are both very good explanations. But if I came to you and said, well, there's this invisible creature that comes out at night and it flies around with little wings and it has little watering things and it goes around and it waters things selectively. That's not why not all of your grass is wet, but some of it is and some of it's not. And you don't know what, and they're invisible. You'd say, no, let's talk about sprinklers or rain. So in this whole idea of an inference to a best explanation, science is biased toward the simplest explanation. That's a reasoning in science called Occam's razor. When you have multiple explanations for something based on the same evidence, we're biased toward believing the simplest evidence. Now, at my house, if the grass is wet, it was probably a sprinkler because here in Utah it just doesn't rain very much. So how would I devise an experiment at the moment to figure out whether it was a sprinkler or rain? Turn the sprinkler on, see if it works. That's good. Or just look at my concrete driveway and see if it's wet. Well, the sprinklers could have on it, and stuff like that. Yeah, but if my sprinklers don't reach into the street, is the street still wet? then it's probably rain. And that's how abductive reasoning works. It tries to shoot toward the best explanation based on the facts, and it's biased toward the simplest explanation. And it also almost always forces you to create a second experiment so you can get rid of the things that you think it might be. You're all scientists. That's how the scientific method works. And so that's how we go about doing evidences toward stuff. In fact, the interesting thing is that this process, you can be thankful for this process existing because of Christians. Because of Christians. This is biblical origins in terms of how to deduce truth. And why do I say that? Because the people who are so well known at the beginning of the scientific revolution of understanding the nature of the universe were mostly Christians. And their premise was this: there is a God, and if God is a God of order, then we should be able to investigate what he made and see order. And at the day, and now to even today, order is expressed mathematically. So the presumption from these first scientists was, God made everything, God is an orderly God, we should be able to explain everything and capture how it works mathematically. That is from Christians who start with the premise that the world is not just chaos. If you go by the whole naturalistic understanding that we came to be not because of God, but because things just happened, billions of years of chance, you really have no philosophical basis to go out and look at the universe and presume that it'll be orderly. It's just chaos. But the early scientists did this. Let me give you one example. This guy, you know him? Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton. He looked at the universe. He's the first one who came up with a unified field theory. What? Yeah, remember the apple falling from the tree? The big leap he made wasn't that gravity pulled the apple to the ground. His leap was the same gravity that pulls an apple to the ground is the same force that puts the planets in orbit. It's what makes things go around each other, this mutual attraction. And it was a crazy proposal for most people because they said, how can you take a force on Earth that pulls an apple to the ground and presume that that's why planets orbit? But he did, and he published a brilliant piece of work called Principia, and in that he described the motion of the planet. He described the motion of all things. And to this very day, in the easiest sense, when we talk about the motion of things, we call it Newtonian motion, the way Newton captured it in mathematics. It's just really brilliant. And that's what he did. And he got very popular and very famous for his mathematics that describe the motion of things. But before you get too carried away saying, well, now that we understand why things are attracted to each other, maybe there is no God, here's what Newton said. Gravity explains the motion of the planets, but it cannot explain who set the planets in motion. God governs all things and knows all that is and can be done. So from Newton's time even to our present, just because you understand the mechanism in nature doesn't necessarily mean that God doesn't exist. And that's a key point that's lost on most scientists, atheists today. We understand the way this works, they'll say, so we no longer have to invoke magic, that is, the God thing, to explain why this is the way it is. We say, no, when we understand the mechanism of the thing, like Newton said, that gives me even more awe to say, wow, God's an incredible designer. So we don't have to push him out of the way. But that's for another time. We don't have time to talk about that. So here's science, but there is bias in science. And you know which of these 4 steps are most biased in science? The last one, in explaining what you see. There is presently a heated debate between creationists, I won't use creationists, let's say intelligent design people and evolutionists. A heated debate. And I heard one of the evolutionists in the debate say to the intelligent design person, well, you have no evidence. What's your evidence for intelligent design? And the intelligent design person said, well, the same evidence you use. The creatures that we see tell me that there's a designer. So actually the top steps are in accordance. We have the same observations. It's how you explain the observations where the separation's happening right now in science. How do you explain what you see? An evolutionist will say, because what we see inside creatures, for instance, let's say DNA. DNA is in the highest creatures, that's us, and the lowest creatures, bacteria. They all have DNA. They will say then, that tells me, that strongly infers that the more complex creatures came from the simpler creatures, because they all have DNA. They all have a common origin. And an intelligent design person would say, I agree with you They all have a common origin, God. So it's the same data, different explanations. So there can be some bias right here. So you have to be careful when you look at science. It's that last step that tends to go off the rails in terms of excluding God, because if you have a pre-bias that God cannot exist, you'll never include God in the fourth step. So you have to be fair about that. Let me show you a classic case of bias. I love this one because this is from where I used to live for 23 years. Harlan Bretz was a geologist who found his way to Washington State, and when he was in Washington State, he looked over eastern Washington State and saw an amazing thing in the geology of the area. And his observations lent him to believe in 1922 that there was massive erosion across eastern Washington. And he coined this phrase, the channeled scablands of eastern Washington. If you ever fly over eastern Washington, look out the window in eastern Washington and you'll see something like this. This is Potholes Coulee. Now if you look on the left over there, you see farmland and it's flat, and even behind there. And then you have this thing in the center. What is that thing in the center? And for most people who look out the window, they say, well, it looks like a lava flow to me. But it's not a lava flow. It's exactly the same hard rock that's underneath the topsoil on the left. So the question is, where did all the topsoil go? And this is all across eastern Washington. Where did the topsoil go? And there's some clues here, because if you look in this picture down over here, see these round holes? Those are potholes. They're like 20 feet across. Something has drilled a hole into basaltic rock. And that something you can look at is from a whirlpool of water. Like, you know, the things when you drain your tub? Well, there were whirlpools of water on top of this, where the water was shifting and moving fast enough and finding impediments that it would stop and it would swirl around. And as it swirled around, it acted like gigantic stone drills, and it drilled gigantic potholes. Now, to have that to happen, you have to have a lot of water moving very fast for some amount of time. A lot of water, not just a good spring runoff. We're talking about a huge amount of water. So he looked at this and said, you know what? The only explanation for this plus so many other features, there's some falls that are there that are dry, and today they're called dry falls. That clearly were created when there was a lot of water falling over this feature. There's this happens with falls when they come over a rock edge. Many times they go over the top and they undercut at the bottom the rock itself before they flow away. You can see these features here. So Brett said, listen, there was a lot of water here at one time, and it wasn't still, it was flowing really fast. A lot of water flowing really fast does not mean a stream or a river. He said, it looks like a catastrophic flood. And he used the F word. And because he used the flood word, he got into a lot of trouble. And why? Well, because at the time there was a pre-bias against the fact that Noah's flood ever existed. Cannot be. Will not be in the evidence. We will not admit to that fact. We see no evidence of a catastrophic flood until you look at the channeled scablands of eastern Washington. And there is no other explanation. It's high erosion, lots of water, like lake, ocean, sea-size water moving from one place to another very fast for an extended period of time. That's just the only explanation. The evidence doesn't just point to it, it has to make that happen. Unless you're a Star Trek fan and you know the Borg, they come and they actually, suck stuff off. Not many Star Trek fans. Okay, but anyway, that's what he said. And he used the flood word, and because of that, plus another thing, at the time, geologists were convinced that everything that you see today is as it always has been. For instance, that's called uniformitarianism. There's a couple other names for it, steady state. But basically it says, as you look backward in time infinitely, nothing really hugely remarkable has changed. Everything is kind of slow and changing. If you see erosion, it's because a river has eroded over a long amount of time. If you see continents moving, it's because they've been moving a slow amount over a long period of time. You look backwards, and basically everything is relatively uniform. That was the mandate at the turn of the century, in the last century, for geologists. So when Bretz comes along and says, I've seen evidence of a catastrophic flood, it's undeniable. He used the F word, which made them think that he was promoting Genesis 1. and they won't go for that. And plus, they went against the primary bias of the time, uniformitarianism. Everything is the way it always has been and will be, slow changes. He got in a lot of trouble about this. And they even invited him secretly, not secretly, but they said, hey, why don't you come to Washington, D.C., do a presentation at the Geological Society of Washington, D.C. So they invited him to come in 1927. He gave his presentation, and it was an ambush. There was half a dozen other geologists that were there to basically slam him and kill his theory. Just nip it in the bud before it got very far. He was ambushed. And it's very clear. You can read what Brett says about this at the time. They will not accept any opening of the door to the fact that the creation flood might be an evidence right here, because that gives those Bible people too much evidence. So when it comes to explaining this water, we don't have a better explanation of the catastrophic flood, but I do know one thing. It's not Noah's flood. Why? What does the evidence say? The evidence doesn't say it. The evidence says it's a catastrophic flood. It could be. Why won't you entertain that? Bias. You see this bias rise up a lot in science, and it comes in that fourth stage, the best explanation, the best explanation. In Brett's case, the geologists were of one mind. The best explanation that we can infer is there was a gigantic flood with lots of water that didn't sit still, but it flowed massively for a good period of time. Huge amount of water. Huge amount of water. Now, Brett's was pretty much alone until someone found evidence of a large Ice Age lake in western Montana. Ice Age, measured in tens of thousands of years. Ice Age lake. And when they looked at this Ice Age lake, you can actually go to parts of western Montana in the hillsides of the mountains and see watermarks where the water has lapped up very high in elevation. And they said, you know what? There could have been a gigantic lake right here called Lake Missoula, really huge. Could have been a huge lake right here. And right here at the end of this valley, at the mouth of this valley that points toward the west, towards Spokane, where the Channel Scablands are, there was probably an ice dam right there. And that ice dam was actually the end of a geologic feature back then in the Ice Age, where one of the glaciers, its last finger of the glacier, was holding back this water until the glaciers receded with the warming. And just when it came back and pulled its finger out, the glacier let that water out, and a huge amount of water flowed westward out of Missoula, Montana. Huge. Covered the western third of Montana, flowed out, went into northern Idaho, headed south across the Rathdrum Prairie, turned westward and continued out through the Spokane Valley in eastern Washington and into the present-day Columbia River Valley, and then it went down the Columbia River, which separates Oregon and Washington. This gigantic flood of water, and it's going down there, carrying all the topsoil of eastern Washington with it until it gets to Portland, Oregon. And Portland, Oregon, the Columbia River doesn't go directly out to the sea. It has to take a turn north or south. And so it turned south, it slowed down its water, and all the soil that was diffused in the water, once it had slowed down, deposited. And today, the Willamette Valley in Oregon, in western Oregon, one of the most fertile places in the world, has Spokane's dirt. We're still a little bitter about that. So once that was postulated, the geologists said, oh, okay, we'll go with that. We can have a gigantic catastrophic flood as long as it's not the Bible's flood. And so his theory and his observations were accepted as an inference to the best explanation as long as it's not the biblical explanation. Years later, a couple years before he died, he was honored. Bretz was honored. Right here in 1979, he got the highest medal of the Geologic Society of America, the Penrose Medal. 1979, that makes him 97, a couple years before he died. So he accepts this medal because he stayed with this his entire life. 50 plus years he pushed on this because the bias of the Geological Society would not get rid of uniformitarianism, and it wouldn't let go of resisting the Bible. So when he accepted the medal, he said a great thing. This is what he said when he accepted the medal. All my enemies are dead, so I have no one to gloat over. I love J. Harlan Bretz. But it's a great example of how bias can contaminate the last step when you infer to the best explanation. And so let's take a look at some God-oriented ones. So today is number one in the series. We're going to ask, is there a creator, and can science help us with that? Is there a creator? I'm going to look at three things. the fine-tuning of nature, the Big Bang Theory, and DNA. And one at a time, we're going to look at these one at a time and see if they point toward a creator. They won't prove a creator, but they may point to one and leave the opportunity of a creator open to a scientific mind. So we're going to look at these three really quick and see if it tells us anything. Fine-tuning of nature. What am I talking about? Well, this book. Close. This book, with the exception of the Bible, changed my life more than any other book. What is this? This was my Introduction to Physics for Science and Engineers. This is my college-level introductory physics books. And it started to answer for me, as a child, how do things work and why do they work? And physics is what, I went, whoa! Physics isn't just about particle physics. It's about things like how things move. Thank you, Mr. Newton. You know, how do lenses work when you make a camera? How does thermodynamics work when things burn? It just answers all the questions about everything you run into. This changed my life. But I found an interesting thing in this book. When I opened the front cover of this book, I found something really curious. And the binding's broken, so. Right inside there's a table in the flyleaf of this book on physics. And that table is right here. It's printed in tiny little text right there. And it's physical constants. Physical constants. Because they knew that I was going to have to refer to this a lot of times as you go through all the myriad spectrum of what physics is about. There are these physical constants. Things like Boltzmann's constant. You never use that one. But the one I loved was the gravitational constant. How strongly do things attract each other gravitationally? I had a chance when I was in college to replicate an experiment done back in the 18th century by a guy named Cavendish, who measured the gravitational attraction of two lead balls. And I did that. And you can actually measure it and come up with that constant G. Now that constant G for the gravitational attraction of stuff is a very important number. If it's 2% different plus or minus, the universe you're sitting in would not exist. 2%. Now there's other constants. In fact, when I looked, I got this sheet that I took from another physics book, and you'll notice that when it lists the constants, it would say the number and say how close we know it to be. Like the electronic charge of an electron is 1.601846 10 to the minus 19th coulombs plus or minus 0.000025 times 10 to the minus 19th coulombs. It's got to be that close. Because if the charge of an electron is a little off, the universe you know doesn't exist. What do you mean? That means two things? Like gravity and the charge of an electron have to be the way they are or we don't exist? It gets worse than that. There's close to 25 or 30 of these constants that if any of them are within a couple percent off of what they are, the universe as you know it doesn't exist. And all of them simultaneously have to be that number or the universe as you know it doesn't exist. We saw a video last night and a guy was saying, here's a great way to think of it. Think about the fact, think if there was a room that you had called the universe creation room. And in that room as you step into it, you're going to create a universe. And in that room on the wall are 30 dials of things you can dial in. And every one of those dials represents one of these constants. And you go into that room and you realize that you've got to get all the dials set to exactly the right place or the universe is not inhabitable by life. So you go in and you play, you monkey with it. You look out, no life. No life. And then suddenly one day you realize that someone has come in with a Sharpie and marked this little black line next to each dial. And if you take all the dials and you line them up to that little black line on every one of the 30 of them, you look out, universe that can support life. Scientists today all admit the fact that we live in a universe that's finely tuned in a very improbable way. I don't know any scientist who disagrees with that. Because science allows us right now to go into the theoretical room of the manufactured universes and change the value of G, the gravitational constant, and look out and mathematically see what happens to the universe. You can do that now. You can do it. And they've done this with a number of these factors. And I got to tell you, the universe will not support life if any of them are a little off and very close. It's really a curious thing. Why would it be that you and I exist in a universe that these 30 factors have to be extremely fine-tuned or else we wouldn't be here? It's highly improbable that life should exist not just on Earth, but anywhere in the universe, unless these are all finely tuned. Now this is where you start to get to the inference to the best explanation right? That last step. No one disagrees about the observations at all. It is really a remarkable thing that we're even here. The odds are very low. Very, very improbable that life should be anywhere. But they're all precisely dialed in. One of the ways that scientists today try and get around this is they've come up with a theory that says, well, we're not the only universe that exists. There's actually an infinite number of parallel universes that simultaneously exist. You just can't see them. And in those parallel universes, they all had the random dial stuff, and they couldn't support life. And in the billions and billions and billions of universes that all coexist, but they can't see each other, ours happens to be the one out of the billions and billions that happens to support life. So no big deal. Scientific method. Do they have evidence of those other universes? No. It's just an inference to a best explanation, which is actually not a very good explanation. But what it does is it exhibits the fact that they are nervous about the fact that our universe looks intelligently fine-tuned. And that's disturbing. That's disturbing. Stephen Hawking, this is a picture of him many years ago in the 80s when he wrote his book that was so popular, Brief History of Time. Look, he even says it. The laws of science as we know them at present contain many fundamental numbers, like the size of the electric charge of the electron, that's the one I just read, the ratio of the masses of the proton and the electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. Does Stephen Hawking believe in God? No. He's very much on the other side of the discussion. But all scientists admit the fact this is a very curious thing. What's the best inference, the inference to the best explanation? Well, I think the inference to the best explanation is that there's a tuner, and his name is God. There's a tuner who decided to make a universe, and in order to enable us to be in this universe, he dialed it exactly in place, and now it works. If it's left to chaos, stochastic processes, chance, we should not be here. And every scientist admits that. But they'll say, but we're here, so it proves that even though it's highly improbable, it must still be by chance. Wait a second. It's almost impossible. I mean, it's impossible that this can happen. There's Fred Hoyle, who was an astronomer, a British astronomer, and I think he died in 2001 or 2, something like that. But Fred Hoyle was really kind of a perky guy. He doesn't believe in God, but he did look at the conditions it takes to make life happen, and he also said, this is just not going to happen. And he said it's something like this: the chances, this is a rough quote, the chances that a single protein molecule could self-assemble when you put it in a pool of the composite chemicals that make it, the chances that a protein molecule could self-assemble all by itself with no one's help is the same as a whole star system of blind men solving Rubik's cubes simultaneously. And that's even more probable than what we see. So scientists know this, and it's disturbing to science. We either have a fine tuner or we are all extraordinarily lucky because of the fine tuning. Let's go to the Big Bang. This is one of my favorites. Big Bang. Big Bang. There was nothing, scientists say today, and then all of a sudden in a split second, there was something. And before the something, there was nothing. All the something that you know today came out of nothing. Now, the reason scientists say this is still not very popular. This took decades, like Brett's thing about the flood. It took decades to be accepted because cosmologists, the people who understand how stars came to be, also wanted to presume that the universe is as it has always been in eternity past and into eternity future. And if you ever watch Carl Sagan on Cosmos, he said, no, the cosmos is all that is or ever was or ever will be. That's uniformitarianism. Nothing catastrophic happened to bring the universe into existence. Just like for geology, nothing catastrophic happened to bring geology into existence. So when the Big Bang Theory was proposed, and it's been around for quite some time, since the turn of the last century, all of the cosmologists said, no, everything is as it has always been. It did not have a start, because if we admit there was a start, those Bible thumpers will get all over us again. Because their claim is that God made everything, which means the universe had a start, and we know the universe did not have a start. It's the bias in the last step again, is what it is. Well, what happened was this. Back in the 60s, The earliest communication satellites we put in orbit were gigantic metallized spheres. They were mylar spheres, and they would inflate in orbit, and they would bounce telephone signals via microwave transmitters from the ground onto these big balls, and they'd come down. In fact, they made a stamp to show how it works. Right down here. There's the stamp. See those little things going up? And they did that. It was a passive reflector, and that's how they would send telephone calls to Europe. The problem was, for this to work, and it didn't work really well, the problem was the transmitters had to be really powerful because most of the energy is going to be lost to somewhere else. And the receivers had to be extraordinarily sensitive. So about 1964, one of these receivers was still sitting around in Bell Labs in New Jersey, and this is one of the receivers for that failed program. And a couple of guys by the name of Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson decided to use this for some other kind of stuff. And as they were pointing it into the sky, they kept coming up with problems. The problem was, when we point it into the sky, we see microwaves. And so they said, well, there must be an error in our stuff. And they almost gave up their entire stuff because they couldn't get rid of this error. There's power coming into this. There should be no power coming in. So then they pointed all over the sky. And they kept getting the same power. And then they waited for the Earth to get to another part of its rotation in the year, and they pointed to that part of the sky. And sure enough, it's there too. And they realized there's microwave radiation coming into us from all over the universe. And some people at the time said, you know what? If there was a Big Bang, that's exactly what we would see. Well, I don't think so. I think the universe is what it's always been and it's always going to be, and you can't convince me with a little microwave energy. No. So the debate raged from that time in the 60s all the way up until today. All up until today. But finally, begrudgingly, cosmologists who study the universe said, okay, it's the Big Bang. Boy, are we going to have problems with those Bible people now. Because it's exactly what you'd expect to see if the creation story is true. Exactly. Not even just a little bit off. They pointed at the sky and they found this cosmic microwave background radiation. They got the Nobel Prize for it in 1978. That's how long it took. 14 years before anyone said, I think these guys were right all along. 14 years. And it spawned an entire series of more investigations with satellites. To date, 4 satellite missions have been sent up into space to map what that background radiation looks like. And it has proved that the steady state idea of the universe is false. It isn't what it always has been and will be. It had a beginning. The universe had a beginning. This is very troubling to scientists. Very troubling. But it is the universal interpretation of the evidence. You can look at the universe that we have today, and it is certainly going from one thing to another. And when you back up the film and make it go backwards, the universe had a start. Just like Genesis 1 said. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There was a start. And before that start, there was nothing. Scientists today will say, before that big thing happened, there was nothing. So you're telling me that the entire universe of matter and energy started from nothing? And the physicists will say, yes. What? That's exactly the Genesis 1 story. And that's the thing that cosmologists would admit for their entire lives, unless they had this kind of evidence to force them and to twist their arm into accepting it. And today there is no debate. That's what happened. So what's the inference to the best explanation that at one time in our universe's history, there was nothing and then there was something? The best inference is God. And then you add the first topic to it. Not only did the universe not exist at one point, and then it did exist, but when it did come into existence, all of those constants that we talked about, whoa, aren't we lucky? Those all settled in the first microseconds of the creation of the universe. They all went, whoop, got stuck, and then we have the universe. How is it possible that with such a cosmic, chaotic event like the Big Bang, where there's nothing and then boom, there's everything, that those constants get set at the beginning and they allow life to happen later on? That's astonishing. So now we have 2 events that are like, well, fine-tuning must have a tuner. A start to the universe must have a starter. And that's the problem. It seems to be that my best explanation is God. And we'll do one more, then we'll quit after that. How about DNA? I love this topic. DNA, the strands. You know, this is a close-up of a DNA, not a real DNA molecule, but it's got It's got this it's like a twisted ladder in a sense, right? And the rungs of the ladder, there's only two kinds of rungs, but they can be both ways. So any rung can be one of two rungs, and left or right in that sense. And it's a beautiful structure because you notice there's two different colors on the rungs. You can split this ladder in half and keep the half rung on each side and still be able to recreate the other half because they only mates up, there's only one of two kinds of rung. It's a brilliant system. Brilliant system. And they found out that it actually carries the biological recipe for all human things. Not just you, but for bacterium and for plants. It's a recipe. It's a recipe carrier is what it is. In humans, we are fully specified by over 3 billion of those little rungs. They're called base pairs. 3 billion of those. And they are so prevalent in your body that with a few exceptions there in every single cell of your body is those 3.5 billion pieces of information about you. We can take a cell out of your body, and if we could clone you from that cell, we could take all the information just from that little piece of DNA and make you. And nearly every cell in your body has one of those. And it's 3.5 billion rungs long. Wow, way cool. This was really cool. You got this? We found out that actually the sequence, as you go down the list of which rungs are in order, they match up to form a protein, which is really nice because a protein is actually a serial connection of a bunch of smaller chemicals. All you need to do is take this chemical, put next to this chemical, this chemical, this chemical, and when you're done, you have a protein molecule. It's a long string, and because of the gravitational effects of the molecules, they end up folding on each other, making a funny shape, but it's really just a string of what it is. And so you can look at DNA, and you can go down the list of the DNA base pairs and say it needs this chemical, this chemical, this chemical, and then this chemical, and you make a protein. In fact, as we look at the small cells in your body today, scientists say that there's not a protein in your body that was not created from information that came off of a strand of DNA. There's no protein that ever gets created. You can't take the chemicals that make a protein, stick them in a cooking jar or something, and stir them up, put them in a blender, and then suddenly protein comes out. No, they have to be sequenced with information from DNA. That is a scientific fact, the information on DNA. The information molecule that can be split in half and reproduced. And it makes me think of this. A disk drive. This is a disk drive from a dead computer that I've got. Really dead. So, what did it evolve from? That's a good question. So, being one of those guys that takes stuff apart, don't need this anymore, I'm taking this puppy apart. So I did. And this is what you'll find out as you take apart a disk drive. There's the backboard, and when you take that off, you realize it has a bunch of components. The information for your computer is not stored on those. They just figure out how to get it off of the thing that stores it. So where's the information stored? Well, you flip it to the other side and take the cover off, and there's something really, really cool inside. Dun, dun, dun. Pa-ding! Wait a second. Yeah, there's a shiny disk in there. There's a shiny disk in there. And it turns. Ooh. And it has this kind of pivoting arm that hovers over the top of the disk. It goes back and forth. Wee, 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 wee. There you go. And it hovers over the disk. And well, that's really pretty darn cool. So how does that work? Where's the information for the document that I wrote last week? It's actually on that disk because that shiny stuff on that disk is magnetic. It's magnetic. And as your computer works and you store information on your disk, that disk is spinning around at 7,500 RPM. It's very fast. Don't open your disk drive. Because if you open your disk drive and you get even this much dust on the surface of it, it'll crash. Because that little head that's hovering, that's on the swing arm that goes over the top of your disk drive, that little thing is so close to the surface of the disk that a piece of dust will crash it. So you don't open your disk drives. It's a bad deal. It's a dustless environment inside of there. And your information is actually on little magnetized places on the surface of the disk. There's like tracks, invisible tracks of magnetic information, and that swing arm not only records a little piece of magnetism on the disk, but when that comes by later for you to read it, it senses it as well. And so to find the different parts of your files, it goes across the surface of the disk to get your files. Really cool. And if you want a really high-density disk drive, you not only have one disk, but you have a stack of disks that all have their own swing arms in them. It's just really cool. Now, if you were to find this archaeologically, 10,000 years from now, you'd look at that and say, what is this for? This doesn't structurally do anything. It doesn't hold the computer together. It's not a keyboard. It's not a display. I mean, what does it do? Until you realize that this entire structure does nothing mechanical. All it does is hold information. That's all it does, is hold information. And it holds it indefinitely as well. It holds information, and that's a really cool deal. The structure of DNA and the structure of a disk drive is somewhat irrelevant. What's interesting is that they both hold information. You can make a human being from one strand of DNA. Now, there's a problem with this. If I take this disk drive and I put it back together, get all the dust off of it so it works okay, and I put it into a Macintosh computer instead of a PC that it came out of, what'll happen? It'll run twice as fast. No, it won't do anything. It won't do anything. You got to have your Mac digs every once in a while. It won't do anything. Why? Because the information on that disk only works the certain physiology of a computer, and they go together. The information on a strand of DNA will only work if the physiology, the biology of the thing is there. Pigs and humans. I can't take plant DNA and put it in my system and make me work. It's the information that it holds is tailored to the thing it's trying to prescribe. You got that? That's really super important. So here's the big question. If there's information on human DNA, where did it come from? And we know that when you come across information in your daily life, it comes from someone. I mean, the same thing like if you walk on a beach and you see your name written with a stick on the beach. There's your name written there, in English. You don't presume that some kind of sand crab came up and wrote your name in there, because it could have, but the likelihood is extraordinarily low. Extraordinarily low. No, we jump to the most reasonable inference, to the best explanation, which would be a human being wrote it. We see information there. So when you see information in something like DNA, the best explanation is it came from a source of information. It came from something that knew that later on the physiology of some biological creature will need this recipe for this protein. By the way, that's why our DNA between us and other primates is so close, largely because we use the same proteins. So it's very similar is what it is. That's why over 90% of it is the same. Yeah. So the amazing thing is just this. This is not just a remarkable molecule by its structure. It's a remarkable molecule based on its information. And if proteins can only assemble with the information on a strand of DNA, then the question is, in the primordial ooze when nothing existed and life didn't exist, protein is the very first thing you have to have. In fact, you have to have over 200 of them to do the simplest thing in a biological creature. If protein is the first thing that has to exist, what has to exist before it? DNA. So where did that DNA come from that the first protein formed in evolutionary theory? And so, hold on to your seats. There's a lot of scientists today who think that in some cosmic way, billions of years ago, something in the universe, like a big spray can of aerosol, was spraying DNA all over the universe. Don't laugh at this. This is serious. Spraying this all over the universe, and it fell on certain planets like ours where the life could actually take off, and the DNA floated into a pool, and then there was the chemicals for proteins, and the chemicals saw the recipes and said, hey, let's self-assemble into that, and they self-assembled, and then at least 200 proteins came into existence and started life. Who was spraying the can? I know, it doesn't really remove the problem. It just takes the problem to another part of the universe. Where did it come from? But this is the theory of a lot of people these days. If you know Richard Dawkins, who's a very famous and outspoken, he was in a movie that we've seen, and he even said at the end of the movie, well, maybe aliens came and, they sort of did this. And who created the aliens? Another guy, the guy that I quoted before, Hoyle, about the star system full of blind Rubik's Cube guys, he believes in this. It's called directed panspermia. No kidding. It's directed in the sense that it wasn't a spray can over the entire universe. It was just a spray can over a couple of planets like us. But he believes that as well. Because the improbability of the information on DNA showing up before our first protein is made is impossible unless it comes from somewhere else. That's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, just like my disk drive. So the very first protein needed DNA information. Where did the information come from? My inference to the best explanation is the same guy that did the Big Bang and the same guy who fine-tuned the universe to make it hospitable to life. That really is the best explanation. And I say that's the best explanation because the competing explanations from the science community are aliens and directed panspermia. A lot of scientists have done that. And I think that's the point we're trying to make. The classical idea today is that science has no place for God. And yet, what science is finding out in the things that it continues to explore brings us even more so than ever back to the doorstep of there must be a God. There must be a God. And most scientists are just not willing to admit that. It can't be a global flood. Let's go for the Missoula flood. It can't be the fact that everything is fine-tuned. There must be billions of simultaneous universes, and we just happen to be the lucky one. You know, it can't be that the Big Bang was from something because, of course, we see in nature all the time, something comes out of nothing. No, we never see that happening. And we never see it. No, that doesn't make, there's nothing in observable science that supports the explanations they have for these things. Nothing. There's nothing. So you have to understand, science still has a gigantic hole that God can fill. And in fact, as science advances, it keeps pointing us back to the existence of a starter in the universe who fine-tuned it, who started it happen, even left the fingerprints in the universe that the Big Bang happened because we can see the residue from that Big Bang. It tells us there was a start. He left enough of a hint there for scientists to say, hey, we had a start, even though I don't want to believe it. It had a start, and on top of that, before the first life existed, the information for life came from the same starter. God is the best explanation for this. But science will be biased against that. So if you're in a position where you've lost all of your other frames of reference about what's true, whether it's Joseph Smith or whether it's the Bible or whatever, you have to come back to this common base of science today. And science today, although it would rather not admit the truthfulness of the Bible, instead what we find is that what you find in the creation account in Genesis 1 fits perfectly what science is finding today. And it's embarrassing to the science community. It's embarrassing. You can go online and look up these topics yourself and find more about it if you want. I'm not lying to you. This is where things are at today. This is where things are at. One of the most amazing things is in John's gospel, he starts his gospel about Jesus by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And later we see that everything came into being through this Word. This is this Jesus. Interestingly enough, he would use this idea of the Word. What's the Word? Information. A statement and a command to the universe with information. And some of that command to the universe was the sequencing of DNA information that makes you and I exist. It's the fine-tuning of where the dials have their little marker, all that kind of stuff. All of these things, John says, in the beginning was the Word. The beginning of this universe started with a command from God that was full of information, and here we are. Very deliberate. And this is what science points us to. So next time someone with a scientific atheist background says, I'm sorry, science does not accommodate God anymore, go to some of these issues because it needs God for explanation, because all the competing secular atheist scientific explanations, the inference to the best explanation will make you laugh. They're that improbable. Okay, we need to wrap up right now. So my final thoughts. These are not proofs of God, but they clearly are an inference to the best explanation. And if that's true, then God, the God that we know of who did all this stuff, is outside of the time-space constraints of the natural world. He's extraordinarily large. Now, I have to tell you, ours account in Genesis is the only one of the worldwide religions that makes God this big. All the other ones, God is actually a part of the creation. Ours says God made everything. He predates everything. He's bigger than creation itself. That's huge. That's just huge. He's omnipotent then, and he's very, very clever. And he's incomprehensible in the best use of the English word. Comprehend means to fully grasp something and get your arms around it and totally master it. God is someone who, if this is who science is pointing to, is someone who is so much bigger and so much more clever and so much different than us that you may never as creatures be able to totally get your arms around him. Okay? And if there is a creator, and we'll finish with this, then we can ask one gigantic question. Why? If there is a being who created the universe, why did he create the universe? It wasn't chance. One day there was no universe, and then the next day there was. And every time that we see something has a start, it usually has a purpose. It can really allow us to sit where we sit and say, why did God do this? Now, if you come from a totally secular atheist science background, you can't ask why. All you can say is we are. That's the end. We're the result of random chance and some extraordinarily good luck. But if there's a being who started the universe, you can ask why. And next time we do this, we'll ask more than just why, but we'll ask if why, then maybe is he hiding from us, or does he want to reveal himself to us? What is he trying to accomplish when he started the universe? And he included us deliberately in the fine-tuning of it. What's he doing? So we're going to ask a lot of those why questions next week and see if we can answer them in the person of who Jesus is next time. So that'll be the first Sunday in March. The triumphs of his grace. He always wins. Let's pray. And then we're going to sing this great song we sung just a few minutes ago. Praise is rising. Father, we are astonished at your handiwork, and that's what this is. It is your handiwork. Your word tells us that man is without excuse. We can turn and look in any direction, and we can see your handiwork and recognize that it comes from somewhere far beyond ourselves. And in classical history, cultures have seen that as being God, because clearly this is something that we are not capable of, and yet here it is. Here it is. And so, Lord, I pray that through not only just the evidence of science that points us in this direction, but in your revealed presence to us in Jesus, that we might come to understand something about this God who had a reason to start the universe and a reason to fine-tune it to include us. So we thank you for your great love for us, which has come down through all these years. And thank you for this now in Jesus' name. Amen.